In 1939, a retired air commodore named John Turner was told to lay out airfields that could not be flown from. Britain had too few real airfields to lose, and every one had already been photographed from the air. Turner expected a modest program. What he laid out instead was one of the largest deception networks ever spread across a country. The department he ran was small, deliberately obscure, and known by his own name rather than by a function. Its output was enormous. Over the course of the war, it built something in the region of 800 false sites across the British countryside, and the categories are worth separating because each solved a different problem. The daylight sites carried dummy aircraft, built of timber frames, canvas, and tubular scaffolding, assembled largely by film studio carpenters who had spent the previous decade making sets. From 200 feet, a dummy fighter is obviously a dummy. From 20,000 feet, through a bomb site, in haze, it is a fighter. Crews were stationed at these sites to move the aircraft between dispersal points, to cut fresh tire tracks in the grass, and to repair the damage after a raid so that the airfield still looked operational. The night sites were more sophisticated because they had to reproduce the one thing a bomber crew could actually see, which was light. A wartime airfield at night is a set of dim lamps in a pattern, switched on for landings and off again immediately. And the decoys reproduce that with electric lighting rigs run from generators in a bunker, operated by 2 or 3 men who watched the sky and lit their fake runway whenever the real one nearby went dark. The most elaborate category imitated a city on fire. When bombers set the first fires in a target, later waves aimed at the burning. The decoy answered that directly, using arrays of steel troughs and baskets that could be ignited remotely and fed with creosote, oil, and water, in sequences designed to imitate a burning street, a collapsing gas holder, or a firestorm taking hold. The operators sat in a concrete bunker a safe distance away with a switchboard, listening for aircraft, and lit their fires at the moment a raid began, so that a crew arriving over a blacked-out landscape would see what appeared to be a city already burning several miles from the actual one. These sites were placed on open ground, on heath and moor and marsh, away from anything worth hitting. That was the point. The measurement of success is the awkward part. The department's own assessment credited the decoys with drawing a substantial number of raids and a large tonnage of bombs away from real targets, with figures cited in the hundreds of diverted attacks. Later analysis has been more cautious, since attributing a bomb to a decision made in the dark by a crew who did not survive to be asked is not a straightforward exercise, and some of the diverted raids might have missed anyway. What is not in dispute is that the sites were attacked, repeatedly, and that the craters are still visible on open ground in a dozen counties. The scale of the operation is easy to lose in the whimsy of the details. At its height, the department employed thousands of people, consumed timber, canvas, cable, and fuel oil in a period when all 4 were rationed, and maintained sites in every region of the country. The oil burned by the fire decoys in a single night at a single site ran to thousands of gallons. Every one of those sites also needed men to run it, which in 1941 meant men not doing something else. The counter-argument that matters concerns what a decoy actually does, which is not to prevent bombing but to move it. A raid drawn away from a factory falls somewhere, and the somewhere was frequently farmland, but not always. Decoy operators knew this, and there are recorded cases of nearby villages being hit by bombs meant for a fake fire a mile away. The people running the switchboards were making a trade on behalf of people who had not been consulted and did not know the sites existed. What makes the network particularly unsettling is what it did to the map. For a period of 6 years, a substantial portion of what German intelligence believed about the British landscape was manufactured, and the belief was not stupid, because it was based on photographs of things that were really there. The objects existed, their purpose was the lie. And the maps built from that photography, marked with airfields that had never launched an aircraft, are among the most carefully compiled documents of the war and among the least accurate. The bunkers survive on the moors, concrete, half-buried, with the cable runs still visible, sitting in the middle of nowhere for no reason a walker would ever guess. Number 2. The islands that were not there. In 1942, a civil engineer named Guy Monsell floated concrete towers out into the Thames estuary, and sank them onto the seabed. The estuary is the approach to London. It has no islands, and anti-aircraft guns require solid ground. Maunsell expected temporary platforms. What he sank there instead became one of the strangest sets of structures ever added to a nautical chart. The problem was geometric. German bombers and mine-laying aircraft approached London up the estuary, and the estuary is wide, shallow, and empty. Guns on the shore could only engage aircraft that had already passed them, which meant the approach was effectively undefended for its entire length. The solution was to put the guns in the water. The first design was naval, a reinforced concrete pontoon built in a dry dock, with two hollow towers rising from it carrying the gun platform, accommodation, and stores. The whole assembly was towed out, flooded, and sunk deliberately onto a sandbank, where the pontoon settled into the seabed, and the towers stood clear of the water. 4 of these were placed. The second design was an army pattern, and it is the one that appears in photographs. Instead of a single unit, it was a cluster of 7 separate steel towers on 4 legs each, sunk in a fixed geometric arrangement and then connected to one another by walkways at the top, so that the whole formed a single fort spread across the water. Each tower held a different function, with the central one carrying the control equipment and the outer ones the guns and the searchlight. 3 of these clusters were installed. Crews of well over 100 men lived on them for weeks at a time, in structures that had not existed at all a month earlier, and that stood in water where the chart showed nothing but a sand shoal. Life on them was its own problem. The towers were steel boxes standing in the open sea, cold, damp, and in constant motion in heavy weather, connected to one another by narrow walkways with rope handrails, 70 feet above the water, which men crossed in the dark during action. Supply came by boat and stopped entirely in bad weather, sometimes for a week at a time. One of the naval forts was struck by a ship in fog in the 50s and collapsed with loss of life, and the wreck is still there on the seabed, marked as an obstruction. The forts worked. They shot down aircraft and a number of flying bombs, and more importantly, they closed the approach, forcing raiders to route around the estuary or accept being engaged for the length of it. What happened afterward is the part that belongs on a list about maps. The forts were decommissioned in the 50s and left standing, because removing them was expensive and they were not in the way. They therefore remained on the charts as fixed structures in international or ambiguous waters, unowned and unguarded. In the 60s, they were occupied by pirate radio operators, broadcasting from platforms that no government would clearly claim. One of the naval forts, sitting outside territorial waters as they were then defined, was occupied by a former army major who declared it an independent principality, issued passports and coins, survived an attempted takeover, and passed the title to his son. It has never been recognized by any state, and it has never been removed. A structure built to hold an anti-aircraft gun for 4 years became a self-declared country, because nobody had a procedure for a place that was not supposed to be a place. The counter-argument to including it here is that these were never secret and never intended to deceive. That is true, and it is why the entry sits at the bottom of the list. What it demonstrates is a different point, which is that a war can put permanent objects into places where the map says there is only water, and that once they are there, the categories the map uses begin to fail. What makes them particularly unsettling is how they look now. Several are still standing, rusted through, the walkways long collapsed, the towers standing separately in the water like the remains of something much older. They appear on modern charts as hazards. Boats are advised to keep clear. Proposals to demolish them have been raised and dropped repeatedly on cost grounds, and a preservation trust now argues for saving them. The sand around them has shifted for 80 years, and the legs have scoured. And every survey that goes out to check them reports a little more decay in structures that were designed for a service life of a few years, and that no one has ever worked out how to take away. Number 3. The neighborhood on the roof. In 1942, a Hollywood art director named John Detley stretched burlap and chicken wire across the roof of an aircraft factory in Seattle. The plant built heavy bombers, it sat under the approach to a major port, and it covered 26 acres. Detley expected to hide a roof. What he stretched over it instead was one of the most convincing fake neighborhoods ever constructed. The problem with a bomber factory is that it looks like a bomber factory. A vast rectangular building with an unbroken roof, sitting beside an airfield, next to a river, is identifiable from the air at any distance and cannot be disguised as anything smaller. The approach taken here was not to hide the building, but to put something else on top of it. The material was theatrical. Chicken wire stretched over a light timber frame, covered with burlap and canvas, painted and then populated. There were houses with sloping roofs, made of plywood and canvas over frames, and they were laid out in blocks with streets between them. There were trees, made from wire and painted feathers or chicken wire and spun glass, and shrubs and lawns painted onto the fabric. There were parked cars. There were fences and clotheslines, and the clotheslines had laundry on them, which was moved on a schedule so that an aerial photograph taken one week would not match one taken the next. Workers took their lunch breaks up there and walked the fake streets, which added moving figures to the picture. Seen from the ground, from any angle, the whole thing was obviously a canvas structure on a roof. Seen from 20,000 feet, which was the only viewpoint that mattered, it was a residential suburb. The scale of the fabrication is the part that sounds invented. Photographs from the period show inspectors walking down a street of houses, past parked cars and fenced gardens, on a surface that flexes underfoot, with the whole assembly suspended over a working factory floor where several thousand people were assembling bombers. The houses were around 3 feet tall in some sections, built to a compressed scale so that they read correctly from altitude, which means the fake streets could not be walked down by an adult standing upright, and had to be laid out to be seen rather than used. The same approach was applied at other plants on the West Coast, with the aircraft factories in Southern California receiving even more elaborate treatment, including netting stretched over entire parking lots and an airfield runway painted to look like a continuation of the surrounding fields. The officer who drove much of that program had spent years before the war lobbying for camouflage as a discipline and being ignored, and the reversal came within weeks of the attack that brought the country into the war. The film industry supplied most of the expertise, because set builders and matte painters were the only people in the country who did this professionally. The counter-argument is that none of it was ever tested. No enemy aircraft attacked the continental United States in any meaningful way. The Japanese launched thousands of balloons carrying incendiary devices across the Pacific, a small number of which reached the mainland, and a submarine shelled a coastal installation, and that is essentially the entire list. The camouflage program cost a great deal of money and effort, and defended against an attack that never came, and whether it would have worked is unknowable. The officer behind the wider program had been arguing for a camouflage service since the mid-30s, had been dismissed as an eccentric, and had trained a group of volunteers at his own expense. Within weeks of the attack that brought the country into the war, he was given a command, a budget, and access to every studio in Southern California, and the men who had spent the previous decade building the backdrops for musicals spent the next 4 years disguising factories. What makes it particularly disturbing is the reasoning behind building it anyway. The decision was taken in the months after a fleet was destroyed at anchor, because nobody had believed an attack was possible, and the entire West Coast spent the following year assuming it was next. The fake suburb on the roof was a rational response to a fear that turned out to be wrong, built by people who had no way to know that at the time. The photographs are the strange part. There are aerial images from the period showing a quiet residential district of small houses, trees, and streets, indistinguishable at a glance from the real neighborhoods around it. And the district never existed, and underneath it, several thousand people were building the aircraft that were flattening cities on the other side of the world. Number 4. The city painted over a city. In June 1941, an architect named Boris Iofan began painting fake streets across the roofs and squares of the Moscow Kremlin. The complex is a red-walled triangle beside a river bend, recognizable from the air at any altitude. Iofan expected to blur the outline. What he painted instead was one of the most ambitious urban disguises ever attempted. The German advance had begun in the same month, and the assumption in Moscow was that bombing would follow within weeks, which it did. The Kremlin is the single most identifiable target in the country, and it is impossible to move. It also sits next to a large open square, a river, and a distinctive street pattern, all of which act as navigation markers for a crew approaching in the dark. The response was organized within days. The roofs of the palaces and government buildings were painted to look like rows of ordinary city blocks, with dark rectangles standing in for pitched roofs and pale lines for the streets between them. The famous walls, which are red, were painted over in grays and browns to break the outline. The gilded domes of the cathedrals inside the walls, which catch light from an enormous distance, were painted matte or covered. Canvas was stretched over the open square beside the wall, painted to continue the fake street pattern across it. And wooden structures resembling buildings were erected on the square itself, so that the void would not read as a void. The mausoleum on the square was concealed inside a wooden shell built to look like an ordinary house, and the body inside it had already been evacuated by train to a town in western Siberia, where it spent the war in a converted agricultural college under guard. Elsewhere in the city, the deception ran in the other direction. Fake industrial districts were laid out on empty ground beyond the edge of the built area, with dummy buildings and lighting, so that crews looking for factories would find some. Bridges were disguised, and false bridges were built across the river a short distance from the real ones. The river itself, which is the most reliable navigation feature of all, was partly disguised where it ran past critical areas by floating structures and by painting the banks. The same program ran across the country. Leningrad disguised its cathedrals and gilded spires, sending climbers up to cover the domes with paint and canvas, while the city was under siege and starving. Factories in the Urals were painted to resemble open ground. Whole fake industrial districts, fake airfields with wooden aircraft, and fake bridges were built to draw attacks away from the real ones, and the practice of disguising the shape of a thing was formalized into a doctrine that the Soviet military applied at every scale for the rest of the century, from a single tank to an entire offensive. How well any of it worked is genuinely difficult to assess. Moscow was bombed heavily through the second half of 1941. The Kremlin was hit on multiple occasions with real damage and deaths, and the air defense of the city was dense enough that many crews bombed from high altitude without accurate identification. Attributing a miss to the paint rather than to the guns, the searchlights, the weather, or ordinary navigational error is not possible with the surviving evidence. The counter-argument is more fundamental. Camouflage of a fixed target on this scale works against visual bombing at altitude in daylight and works far less well against a crew who has navigated by dead reckoning to a river bend and is dropping on the area rather than the building. Several historians regard the whole effort as a morale project as much as a military one, aimed at least partly at the population, who could see that something serious was being done. There is also a political dimension that is difficult to separate from the military one. The fortress being disguised was not only a target, but the seat of a government that had just presided over a catastrophic defeat, and the decision to keep that government in the city, rather than evacuate it, was itself a signal. The paint was part of a larger message that the capital would hold. What makes it particularly unsettling is the photographs. There are aerial images of Moscow from that period in which the center of the city is a plausible grid of ordinary blocks, and the fortress that had defined the place for 500 years simply is not in them. It had not moved, it had not been destroyed, and it had not been hidden by smoke or netting. It had been painted out, by hand, by people on ropes and scaffolding, working through the summer of the worst military collapse in the country's history. Number 5. The dock built out of sewage pipes. In 1944, an architect named Basil Spence built an oil dock at Dover out of scaffolding, canvas, and old sewage pipes. It had to look permanent from 20,000 feet and explain an invasion that was not coming. Spence expected a modest prop. What he built instead became one of the most photographed structures that never existed. The purpose was arithmetic. An invasion force needs fuel, and fuel needs a terminal, and a terminal takes months to build and cannot be hidden. If an enemy sees an enormous fuel installation being constructed opposite the narrowest crossing of the channel, the enemy concludes that the crossing will happen there. The dummy installation covered a large area of the harbor and its approaches. Pipelines ran across the ground, made from old sewage pipe and painted metal drums. Storage tanks were built as canvas over scaffolding frames. There were pumping houses, jetties, and a network of connections that made sense as a system, because a photographic interpreter looks for coherence and will notice if the pipes do not go anywhere. Wind machines and smoke generators were used to give the site the visual signature of activity, and vehicles were driven around it on a schedule so that successive photographs would show movement rather than a static and therefore suspicious installation. The construction was deliberately visible and deliberately slow so that successive reconnaissance flights would show progress. Then the deception was pushed into a register that is difficult to imagine now. The king visited the site and was photographed inspecting it. A senior general made a public appearance there. Newsreel cameras filmed the installation, and the footage was shown in cinemas. The point of all of this was that neutral countries had journalists and embassies, and enemy intelligence read the newspapers and watched the newsreels, and a story that runs in public is more credible than one that has to be stolen. A structure made of sewage pipes and canvas was inspected by a head of state for the benefit of an audience that was never supposed to know it was the audience. The same approach was applied along the whole southeastern coast. Dummy landing craft, built from oil drums, timber, and canvas on a floating frame, were moored in eastern harbors in numbers, riding at anchor and rising and falling with the tide. Inflatable tanks and trucks were parked under inadequate camouflage netting in Kent fields, positioned so that the netting failed to hide them, since a vehicle that is too well hidden is a vehicle that does not appear in a photograph. Fake camps were laid out with tented lines and cooking fires lit at the correct times of day. The dock was one component of a deception effort that also included false radio traffic, double agents feeding reports, dummy landing craft moored in eastern harbors, and inflatable armor parked in Kent fields. The whole apparatus existed to support a single false conclusion, which was that the main landing would come at the narrow crossing and that anything happening further west was a diversion. The counter-argument, and it is a real one among historians, is that the dummy installations were probably the least important part of the deception. German aerial reconnaissance over Britain in 1944 was extremely limited because the Luftwaffe could not survive over southern England, which means the elaborate physical props were photographed far less often than their builders assumed. The parts of the deception that demonstrably worked were the radio traffic and the reports fed through captured agents, which is to say the parts that arrived through channels the enemy trusted. Some of the dummies may never have been photographed at all. There is a further wrinkle in the record. Some of the most widely reproduced photographs of dummy landing craft and inflatable armor come from training exercises and from post-war publicity rather than from the operational sites, and several images that circulate as evidence of the deception have been misidentified for decades. The physical program was real, and it is also the part of the story that has been most heavily mythologized, partly because it photographs well, and radio traffic does not. What makes it particularly disturbing is how the effort was distributed. Enormous ingenuity, industrial materials in a period of severe shortage, and the personal time of a monarch went into structures whose main audience may have been a handful of photographic interpreters who never saw them. And it still worked, because the deception did not depend on any single element being noticed. It depended on everything an enemy could observe pointing the same way, so that any single element failing was covered by the rest. There are 5 more of these, and the last one is a map of a future that required emptying the land it covered first. Subscribe now, and stay for it. Number 6. The division made of rubber and sound. In 1944, an American colonel named Harry Reeder took a unit of artists, radio operators, and sound engineers into France. The unit had 1,100 men, almost no weapons, and orders to impersonate formations of 30,000. Reeder expected a support role. What he took into France instead was one of the only combat units ever built entirely out of deception. The recruitment had been unusual from the start. The unit drew heavily from art schools and advertising agencies, and its ranks included designers, illustrators, and photographers, several of whom became significant figures in American art and fashion after the war. They were assembled because the job required people who understood how things look, which is not a standard military qualification. The deception ran on 3 channels operating together. The visual channel used inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces made of rubberized fabric, inflated by air compressors, and light enough that 4 men could carry one. Tracks were cut into fields with rollers to suggest armor had moved through. Fake supply dumps were built. Bulldozers cut airstrips that were never used. The audio channel used sound. Recordings of armored and infantry units on the move had been made at an American training center, mixed onto wire recorders, and played through 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks, audible for about 15 miles at night. A convoy that did not exist could be heard assembling, moving, and settling into position by anyone within earshot, including enemy patrols and local civilians. The third channel was radio. Operators studied the transmitting style of the real units they were imitating, since every operator has a recognizable rhythm on a key, and then reproduced that traffic after the real unit had moved somewhere else, so that the enemy's direction finding kept placing a division where it no longer was. Around this, the unit ran what its members called atmosphere, which was the part that could not be manufactured in a workshop and had to be performed. Men wore the shoulder patches of the formation they were imitating, painted the correct unit markings on their vehicles, and were sent into nearby towns to drink in cafes and talk indiscreetly about the arrival of a division that was 200 miles away. Fake generals were driven around in staff cars with the correct pennants, saluted by men who had been briefed to salute them, in towns chosen because they had a population that talked. Military police directed traffic at crossroads for convoys that consisted of a handful of vehicles driving in a loop, going out of sight, and coming back around to pass the same junction again, which is a technique borrowed directly from the stage. The men themselves are part of why the story survives. Several went on to substantial careers in painting, fashion design, and photography, and a number of them sketched and painted throughout the campaign, so the unit produced an unusual visual record of the places it passed through, drawn by people who had been recruited precisely because they could see. Their sketchbooks are now in museum collections alongside the technical files. The unit ran more than 20 operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The largest came in March 1945, when it impersonated 2 entire divisions on the Rhine to draw attention away from the real crossing point, in an operation that took several days and involved the whole apparatus running at once. Casualty estimates for the operations they covered are lower than they would otherwise have been, and the figures usually cited run into the thousands of lives, though the counterfactual is by its nature unprovable. The counter-argument concerns exactly that. Measuring a deception means comparing what happened with what would have happened, and no such comparison exists. What can be documented is what the enemy believed, from captured maps and intercepted reports, and in several cases, the enemy believed precisely what the unit had spent the previous week manufacturing. The unit's existence was classified for decades after the war, and the files were kept closed long after the operations they described had ceased to have any military value at all. Members could not explain what they had done, including to families who had assumed they had spent the war doing something less interesting. The files were opened in the 1990s, and a congressional medal followed in the 2020s, by which time almost all of them had died. What makes it particularly unsettling is the position they occupied. 1,100 lightly armed men, whose function was to be found, placed deliberately in front of formations that would have destroyed them, relying entirely on the enemy believing they were something else. In several operations they were shelled, and the unit took casualties. The moment the deception worked perfectly was also the moment they were most exposed, because a convincing armored division attracts exactly the attention an armored division is equipped to survive, and they were not. Number 7. The army that only existed on a map. In 1944, a British officer named David Strangeways rewrote the deception plan covering the invasion of France. German intelligence tracked Allied divisions by radio traffic, by shoulder patches, and by the movements of their commanders. Strangeways expected to inflate real units. What he wrote instead was one of the most successful phantom armies ever placed on an enemy map. The plan he inherited relied heavily on physical props, and he judged that it would not survive contact with a competent analyst. His revision moved the weight of the deception onto information rather than objects. The phantom formation was given a headquarters, a full order of battle, a signals network, and a commander, and the commander was the most famous and most feared American general available, deliberately assigned to a command that did not exist while the real invasion was prepared under someone else. The formation was placed in the southeast of England, opposite the narrowest crossing. The signals traffic was the core of it. A real army group generates an enormous characteristic volume of radio communication, from headquarters to corps to division and down, and that pattern can be read by an enemy who cannot decrypt a word of it, simply from the volume, the locations, and the hierarchy. Specialist units generated exactly that pattern from a small number of transmitters moved between locations on a schedule. The second element was human. Every significant German agent in Britain had been captured and turned, and their reports were being written by British officers. Those agents reported the arrival of divisions, the sighting of insignia, and troop movements consistent with a buildup in the southeast, and they had been fed accurate information for years to establish their credibility, which meant their handlers believed them. The agent network deserves its own accounting. The most productive of the turned agents was a Spaniard who had begun by inventing an entire network of imaginary subagents while living in Portugal, submitting reports on a Britain he had never visited, compiled from guidebooks and newsreels. Recruited properly, he ran more than 20 fictional informants on paper, was paid by both sides, and was eventually decorated by both. On the night of the landings, he was permitted to send a warning that arrived slightly too late to be acted on, which increased his credibility at no cost, and he then spent the following weeks reporting that the landings in Normandy were a diversion. The result appears in the German assessments. Their estimate of Allied divisions available in Britain ran to something close to double the real number. Their maps placed an army group in Kent that consisted of a few transmitters, a set of invented insignia, and a general with nothing to command. And when the landings came in Normandy, the deception held after the fact, which is the part that mattered most. The prevailing German assessment for weeks afterward was that Normandy was a diversion and that the main landing was still to come at the narrow crossing, which held substantial forces in place, away from the fighting, during the period when the beachhead was most vulnerable. The general placed in command of the Phantom Force had been removed from an operational command after a series of public incidents and was, in that period, a soldier without a job whom the enemy rated more highly than any other Allied commander. Assigning him to an army group that did not exist solved two problems at once. It gave the Phantom Force a commander whose presence in England would be taken as decisive evidence, and it kept the man occupied. He was later given a real army and used it. The counter-argument concerns credit rather than facts. The German command was not a single mind. Several senior officers disagreed with the assessment, and the decision to hold armored reserves in place had causes beyond the deception, including command paralysis and the requirement that certain formations could only be released on the direct authority of the head of state, who was asleep. Deception created a possibility that the enemy's own dysfunction then amplified. Historians differ on the weighting, and most treat the deception as necessary but not sufficient. What makes it particularly disturbing is what the German maps looked like. Somewhere in an archive there are situation maps, carefully drawn, updated with new intelligence, showing formations in Kent with unit numbers and boundaries and headquarters locations. They represent competent staff work performed on material that had been manufactured for them. The map was accurate to the intelligence was accurate to the reports, and the reports were written by the other side. Every step in that chain was performed correctly by people doing their jobs well, which is what makes it the most instructive document of the entire deception. Number 8. The city that was taken off the map. In 1942, an American general named Leslie Groves signed the purchase of some 59,000 acres of Tennessee farmland. The land held farms, churches, and cemeteries, and its owners were given a few weeks to leave. Groves expected a production site. What he signed for instead became one of the largest cities ever kept off a map. The valley chosen had two qualities that mattered. It had ridges running through it, which meant that if one facility exploded, the ridge would shield the next, and it sat beside a river system with the largest surplus of electrical generating capacity in the country, which the project needed in quantities that are difficult to convey. At peak, The site consumed around a seventh of all the electricity generated in the United States. Around 1,000 families were removed. Notices arrived giving some households 2 weeks, and the compensation offered was assessed quickly, and in many cases well below what the land was worth. Families who had farmed there for generations were told to leave without being told why, and a number of them applied afterward for permission to return to 10 family graves, which was granted under escort. What went up in their place was a city. It reached a population of around 75,000 within about 2 years, which made it one of the largest places in the state, and it had schools, churches, shops, cinemas, sports leagues, bowling alleys, and a symphony orchestra. It also had a fence around the entire perimeter, 7 gates, and armed guards. Every resident wore a badge, color-coded to the areas that person was cleared to enter. Mail was censored, telephone calls were monitored, and informants were employed among the workforce to report anyone discussing the work. The city was built on unpaved roads, which turned to deep mud in wet weather, and the housing ran from prefabricated homes for senior staff to hutments for black workers, who were segregated, housed separately, and generally barred from the better-paid technical roles. The secrecy was structural rather than merely enforced. The great majority of the workers had no idea what the plant produced. They operated a dial, or watched a gauge, or ran a valve, with instructions to keep a needle within a range and to report anything unusual, and they did that for years. Recruits were told the work would help end the war, and that asking questions was itself a security matter. Signs at the gates and in the plants carried slogans about loose talk, and a system of rewards encouraged workers to report colleagues who speculated aloud about what the plant made. Posters throughout the site reminded everyone not to discuss anything, and the place was absent from the map. It did not appear on state road maps, its name was not used on official correspondence, and the enormous industrial buildings were not marked on anything a member of the public could obtain. The industrial scale is difficult to convey. One building at the site was, when completed, the largest building in the world by floor area, laid out in a flattened U-shape, nearly half a mile long, and it existed to perform a single separation process on a material measured in kilograms. Another facility consumed silver borrowed from the National Reserve, thousands of tons of it, because copper was scarce and silver conducts as well, and every ounce was accounted for and returned after the war. The same arrangement covered the other principal sites, including a laboratory in the New Mexico desert, whose entire population shared a single post office box number as their address, so that children born there had that box number recorded on their birth certificates as their place of birth. The counter-argument is straightforward and was made at the time. The project produced the material for weapons that ended a war which would otherwise have continued, and the security regime was a rational response to a genuine race with a rival program. The costs were borne unevenly, by the families removed from the valley, by the segregated workers in the hutments, and by people who spent years doing something they could not describe. What makes it particularly unsettling is what happened afterward. The city was still not on the map when the war ended. The gates were not open to the public until 1949, 4 years later, and the residents held a ceremony for it. Residents who had worked there through the war learned what the plant had produced from the newspapers, at the same time as everyone else, in August 1945. A place with 75,000 people, its own newspaper, and a symphony orchestra spent 7 years not officially existing, in a country where anyone was free to drive right past it and read nothing about it on any map they could buy. Number 9. The map that was not real. In 1941, an American president named Franklin Roosevelt held up a map of South America during a national radio address. The map showed the continent divided into 5 states, drawn in German, with the existing borders erased. Roosevelt expected proof of a plan. What he held up instead was one of the most consequential forgeries of the 20th century. The address was given at the end of October, 6 weeks before the country entered the war, at a moment when public opinion remained substantially opposed to intervention. The president told his audience that he had in his possession a secret map, made in Germany, showing the reorganization of South and Central America into 5 vassal states with new frontiers, and that one of those states would encompass the Panama Canal. He said the map made the German design on the hemisphere clear. He also mentioned a second document describing a plan to abolish existing religions and replace them with a state church. Neither document was published, and the map has never been produced from any German archive. What has since emerged is where it came from. The document was supplied by British intelligence, which ran a large operation in New York with the explicit purpose of moving American opinion toward war, and it was produced at a facility in Canada that specialized in manufacturing documents. A memoir published decades later by a British officer involved described the forging of exactly such a map, based on a genuine German commercial air route map of the region, altered to show the new boundaries. The account has been debated in detail since, and parts of it are self-serving in the way that intelligence memoirs generally are, but the weight of evidence indicates the map was manufactured, and no serious historian now defends it as a genuine German government document. Whether the president knew is the interesting question, and the honest answer is that it is unresolved. No document records him being told, and no document records him asking. He was receiving a great deal of material through that channel, and he wanted the country in the war. The most that can be said is that the intelligence service supplying him had every reason to give him what he wanted, and the demonstrated capability to make it. The organization behind it was substantial. British intelligence ran an operation out of an office in Manhattan, employing hundreds of people, with a remit that went well beyond gathering information. It planted stories in sympathetic newspapers, ran opinion polls designed to produce publishable results, harassed businesses trading with the enemy, and maintained a document facility in the Canadian countryside capable of reproducing letterheads, seals, handwriting, and inks to a standard that would survive examination. Its purpose was stated internally without embarrassment, which was to move a neutral country toward war. The underlying claim was not baseless, which is the part that complicates any simple reading. German interest in South America was real. There were substantial German communities and sympathetic movements in several countries, and German commercial aviation had genuinely mapped the continent in detail. The forgery dramatized a real strategic concern by inventing a specific document that made it visible, which is a technique with a long history and no expiry date. The counter-argument is that the map probably did not change much. Public opinion moved gradually through that autumn. The decisive event was an attack on a naval base 6 weeks later, and a broadcast about a map is unlikely to have been the hinge. That is probably right, and it does not resolve the underlying problem, which is that a head of state described a document to a nation in a radio address, and the document had been made up by an allied intelligence service. What makes it particularly disturbing is how well the technique reads today. A map is not an argument. It carries no verb, makes no claim in words, and cites no source. It appears to be a description of the world. It can be held up and seen, and its authority comes from the impression that somebody surveyed something. A forged map is therefore a much more efficient object than a forged claim, because it does not present itself as a claim at all, and an audience that would interrogate a sentence will accept a boundary line without noticing that it has accepted anything. The 5 states on that map never existed and were never planned in that form. They were drawn by the side that was telling the truth about the larger picture, which is the detail that makes the episode genuinely difficult rather than simply scandalous, because the forgery was in the service of an accurate assessment, and it worked by making a real danger into a thing that could be held up and seen. Number 10. The map of a future that required emptying the land. In 1942, an agronomist named Konrad Meyer submitted a settlement plan for the occupied territories east of Germany. The plan covered an area larger than France, and the land in question was already inhabited. Meyer expected an administrative document. What he submitted instead was one of the most detailed blueprints for erasure ever produced. Meyer was a professor of agricultural science who held a senior rank in the SS and ran a planning office. The documents his teams produced over several years were not propaganda. They were technical, with population tables, soil assessments, transport calculations, settlement densities, agricultural yields per hectare, budgets, and timetables running over 25 years. The maps show the occupied East divided into settlement zones, marked out as new German provinces with new names, laced with planned road and rail corridors, and dotted with new towns positioned at calculated intervals to serve the farmland around them. It has the appearance of any regional development plan of the period, and it was produced by an office that also handled ordinary agricultural policy, using the same staff and the same standard forms. The arithmetic underneath it is the part that cannot be read as anything else. The plans assumed the removal of the existing population of those territories, and the figures involved run to tens of millions of people, with the drafts giving proportions to be deported east beyond the settlement zones, proportions to be retained as labor, and proportions to be assimilated. The documents do not describe the mechanism in operational detail because they did not need to. They are the demand side of a supply chain whose other end was already being built and operated at the same time, and the connection between the two was made explicit by the officials who commissioned them. The cost estimates included the resettlement of German farmers into the emptied land, in villages laid out on a standard pattern, and the plan assumed a defended frontier line far to the east. The plans did not stand alone. They sat alongside an economic program drawn up before the invasion, which calculated that feeding the occupying forces and the German population from the agricultural surplus of the occupied East would require the populations of certain regions to receive nothing, and which stated the expected consequence in numbers. The two documents share assumptions, personnel and arithmetic. Read together, they describe a single project with an agricultural rationale, in which the land was to be cleared, resettled, and farmed for the benefit of a population that would be moved in afterward. Portions of it were implemented. A region of occupied Poland was designated as a testing ground, and tens of thousands of people were removed from their villages at short notice during the winter, with German settlers moved into the same houses, sometimes into the same rooms, within days. The operation was recorded, assessed for efficiency, and reported on as a pilot. The wider plan was never carried out because the military situation reversed before it could be, which is the only reason the map remained a map rather than a description. Work on the drafts continued into 1943, after the point at which the strategic position had already made them impossible, which is its own comment on the planning office. The counter-argument concerns what the documents prove about intention versus capability. Planning offices produce enormous quantities of speculative material, much of it never approved, and Meyer's plans went through several drafts with different figures because they were revised against a moving strategic picture. It is fair to say that no single approved final version was ever operative. It is not fair to conclude much comfort from that, since the pilot programs were real and the population figures appear consistently across every draft. What makes it the most disturbing entry on this list is the register. Every other map here is a lie about the present, made to protect something or to mislead somebody, and the deception ends when the war does. This one is not a deception at all. It is a sincere technical document about the future, drawn by professionals in the ordinary formats of their profession, in which the removal of the people currently living on the land appears as a logistical input alongside soil quality and rail capacity. Meyer was tried after the war, convicted on a lesser count, sentenced to time already served, and released. He returned to academic life and held a professorship in regional planning at a West German university until his retirement, teaching the same discipline, in the same country, to students who were born after the plans were drawn. The documents themselves survived in the archives, complete with the tables, and they are published. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.